Hello, everyone. My name is Gitika Gorthy, and today I am very honored to be interviewing a very special space champion, Mr. Myles. Mr. Myles is a PhD student at University College London Institute for Risk and Disaster Reduction. Mr. Myles is researching prolonged field care in remote environments and space. Mr. Myles is collaborating with the not-for-profit organization Remote Area Risk International and the Ministry of Defense Royal Center for Defense Medicine. I'm so excited to be able to understand Mr. Myles' journey on a deeper level into space. Welcome, Mr. Myles. Thank you so much for taking some time out of your busy schedule to conduct this interview.
No problem. I'm pleased to be here. Thank you.
Yeah, before we get into understanding your space journey and how you really got into the industry, first I'd like to know more about your typical day. What do you currently do and how does it run?
Well, a typical day is never the same, so there isn't really a typical day as such. So for my PhD, I'm doing some data collection by interviewing healthcare practitioners that are operating in a remote environment. So that at the moment, because of COVID, obviously, that's all happening online. But I'm also doing a couple of other research projects that are specifically looking at space as well. So that is to do with a symposium that we're putting together, which will take place this September. And then another project that's happening next year, which will be the first pilot analog mission in the UK. So really exciting projects. And I really enjoy having not the same day every day.
Yeah, I think that's one thing I love about the space industry is there's always something new and there's new innovation and research you can be a part of. And I think that's one of the best parts about being in the research sector, especially. It's like new every day.
Exactly that. Yeah, it's really refreshing.
Yeah, and as a PhD student, I'm sure you've been a part of some exciting projects or research. And so I'm curious, what is the most exciting project or research that you've worked on or are currently working on?
I mean, that's a big question. There are so many projects that I've really enjoyed working on. I think if I go back to the one that I just mentioned about the first pilot analog mission in the UK, that's really exciting. I've done some projects with analog missions and particularly doing some evaluation research about the emergency planning for disaster risk reduction during analog missions, but they're mostly about European analogs. So this project came about by looking at how to provide interdisciplinary healthcare in remote environments, which goes back to my PhD. What I wasn't expecting when I was putting together my PhD and doing the literature review and something called a concept analysis was that space medicine kept coming up. And if I look back, that does actually make sense because healthcare in space is the remotest environment that we'd be providing healthcare in. So to cut that long story short, an analog mission in the UK would be fantastic because that would open up a whole host of different other research projects. This one, as I say, is going to focus on how to provide interdisciplinary healthcare in space. So not just medicine, but nursing, paramedic science, and other allied health professionals. But what we're looking to do is to expand on this. So it's not just a pilot. Afterwards, we'll be able to do high fidelity missions that will take place in the UK, which will be fantastic.
Yeah, I particularly myself, I'm really a big enthusiast on space medicine. It's actually the area of research I'd like to do when I grew up. And so I've been doing a lot of research on telemedicine and how, a lot of scientists now are trying to incorporate a lot more AI into healthcare systems in space. And so I'm really curious, what are your thoughts on how artificial intelligence or other advanced technology can be used to help telemedicine instead of having to have a flight surgeon on board?
This is a really interesting area and it's an emerging area of research. And it very much depends on the environment that you're going to be providing healthcare in. So, for example, the ISS, International Space Station, has been floating around above the Earth for 20 years. There are actually areas of Antarctica that are more remote than the ISS, because from the ISS, you can get back to Earth within about 24 hours. So, if there's a medical emergency there, you can get back quite quickly. If there's a medical emergency on Antarctica over winter, you're there for months. So it's much more remote, although it's less distance away from help. So AI can really help with that, particularly with remote monitoring of health. My area of research is looking at how to reduce the risk of a disaster. So a disaster in this context is where a patient would physically or psychologically deteriorate, so they need to be rapidly aeromedically evacuated from whatever environment they're in, including space. So if AI could provide us with the monitoring tools and the information to make sure that the first signs of deterioration start to occur, and then early intervention can be put in place, that will reduce the risk of a disaster happening. So that model can be applied on the ISS. It could be also applied on the moon as well, which is a little bit further away. However, if we go a little bit further than that and we're talking about healthcare on Mars, that's an extremely long way from Earth. And a radio signal will take about 20 to 22 minutes one way to get to Mars. So if there's a telemedicine conference between a practitioner on Mars and specialist on the Earth, that's 22 minutes approximately to get from Mars to Earth. For then the practitioners on Earth to provide the consultation and send it back, that's another 20 to 22 minutes. So it's a long time. So there, it then moves into what's called a prolonged field care model, which is the topic that I'm looking at in my PhD, which is how do you provide this interdisciplinary healthcare in the remote environment to reduce the risk of a disaster?
Yeah, I think it's a very important emerging area of research that needs to be done, especially when we're looking into space tourism and long-term missions to going to different planets, like our first human mission to Mars. I think, these are some important things to take into consideration. And I'm also very curious. So I'm actually writing this white paper right now. And so when you were talking, it kind of like lit a bell to me. So I'm trying to research a lot on space environmental factors and how that can impact, this our different body parts. I'm focusing specifically on syncope, but I'm curious, how do you think, apart from just the psychology of being in space, how do you think our body, from what you've researched and what you've learned, how do you think space environmental factors are impacting our body? And how do you think we can combat this? Like other than exercise, of course, because in the future, we want all types of people to go into space. We don't want to just have fit, young males or females to go to space. We want to have everyone go. So, what are your thoughts on that?
For sure. Well, to answer that question, it depends what lens you examine this through. So, from a biomedical lens, which is about the physiological health of patients in space, which more closely associates with space medicine. Obviously, being in a low gravity or a zero gravity environment, the risk there is that the musculoskeletal system begins to deteriorate, and we get what's called muscular atrophy, so muscle wastage. Doing exercise in space can combat that. So we have to adapt the exercise that we're doing because it's in a zero or low gravity environment. So astronauts, for example, will do between 2 and 6 hours of exercise a day. That might be resistance training, it might be on a treadmill, and that will maintain muscle mass. It obviously depends on the physiology of the person, how much muscle they go with. But that's one thing that we can do. An area of research that's happening at the moment is actually looking at we may not need to do that much exercise because if we think about it on Earth, when we've got normal atmospheric pressure and normal gravity for us, we don't actually have a constant supply of gravity on or strain of gravity on our body. When we're standing up, the pressure on our skeletal system is greater, so therefore our muscles will come into play there to make sure we stand upright. But actually, we spend 6 to 8 hours a night lying flat, so the pressure on our skeletal system is less. So there's lots of research at the moment that's looking at how much exercise do we actually need to maintain our musculoskeletal mass. But let's look at this through a different lens. You asked about health in the remote environment of being in space. So one area that I'm particularly interested in is anthropology, particularly medical anthropology in space. This is a very large area. And one aspect of this that answers your question is about how does the environment itself affect our perception of what is good health? So being in a remote environment, particularly in space, is very likely to change our perception of what good health is. And a really good example of this is the current pandemic. Most of the world, I think it's about a third, are still in lockdown, staying at home. So that's definitely not our normal. We're usually going out of our homes and doing regular exercise, even if it's just walking to and from work, school, or college. But we've adapted within the last year, and many people don't have the option of doing that perhaps. So our perception of what good health is has changed. So looking at health from an anthropology perspective, that will give us those answers on how health will change. So, in short, health is a broad spectrum. It's not just physical health, it's psychological health, it's occupational health, economic health, spiritual health. There's a holistic spectrum here. So, all of that needs to be considered when we're talking about health in space.
Thank you for providing that deep insight. I think those are some points that I haven't really, thought about before. And so being able to not only think about the psychological or physiology of the body and how space can impact it, but also other lenses and, looking through it in a different way is it's really important in research, especially. So I'm glad you were bringing that into our attention. And I'm also, so I got into space medicine really very recently. And as a student, I feel like it's not a very common career a lot of my friends talk about. It's not a career teachers know about. I mean, I was talking with my AP biology teacher earlier, and I was telling her I want to go into space medicine. And she was like a little shocked at first because she didn't hear about this before and she didn't know a lot about it. So I'm curious, how did you get into space medicine? How did you discover your passion for it? I'm sure there might have been a few moments where it kind of clicked. So could you share that with us?
Sure. I mean, like I said earlier on, I never set out to specialize in space medicine or to look at this from a research perspective. So I'm a nurse by background, and my clinical practice is mostly pre-hospital in remote environments. So I've been doing that for a number of years. My PhD is obviously looking at prolonged field care, which can be called nursing care in a remote environment. And as I said, when I was doing the literature review and what's called a concept analysis of my PhD, it came across space medicine. And that really opened the door to all avenues that space medicine can lead to. And what I've been really impressed with is the small community and the small world of space medicine is very welcoming to new ideas, very encouraging. So it's a great area to go into, whether that's from research or practicing space medicine. And one of the things I've learned over the last year is that it's not just one group of people that are needed in space medicine or the space field in extension to that. It requires a huge amount of people, not just engineers and scientists. Artists, musicians are needed. People that can creatively write are needed. Architects are needed. So space is a very welcoming environment to be in. So it's a great profession to go into.
Yeah, actually, a reason I started the interview series is really to highlight these diverse careers. I mean, as a student myself, I didn't know about all these career opportunities till I randomly made a Google search, and not everyone thinks about or doesn't click suddenly to like just search up random words together like space policy and put it together and be like, that's a real career. And so part of this interview series is to highlight these diverse careers that you were talking about. I mean, when I didn't realize space policy was like a real career. I knew there were you know you need to have lawyers. I didn't think space policy was like a real track though. And so when I heard about it, I was like, this is mind blowing. I mean, space policy, space medicine, artists, journalism, marketing, business, everything is involved. And being able to, see that. And, one person said space is a place, like it's its own, little world. There's everything you need in a regular world in that industry. So going into the space industry is definitely viable for anyone and regardless of your interests. I mean, there's also this stereotype like you have to be a super genius, you have to be like Albert Einstein, but really you can have a passion for space, a drive to learn, and you can definitely be a part of the space industry.
Absolutely, I totally agree with that. And I think at the moment it's a really exciting time to get involved in space. Maybe 5, 10 years ago, it was seen as an environment that was almost sci-fi like. And you're right, not many people did consider or even discover space as a viable career. But now I think because of ventures of the private industry collaborating with public sector and governments, there are a huge number of opportunities right across the world, not just in the US or in Europe. There are many countries that are getting involved in space within their own right and within their own specialism, which I think is fantastic.
Yes, I've been seeing a lot more, especially, on Twitter and social media. I see a lot more traction to the space industry, especially with just, private companies like SpaceX is a really popular one, getting involved. And it's not just government organizations anymore, like NASA or the European Space Agency. It's something more private organizations are collaborating, which, creates more jobs. So it creates more awareness. More exposure. And I'm really excited about the whole commercialization of space as well, because I believe that space will truly be understood for its value as this continues to grow.
Absolutely. And you struck a really important point there about the value of space and answering the question, why do we need to go to space? There is a counter argument that it's extraordinarily expensive to even send things to space, let alone send people into space. So why aren't we using that money to solve the problems here on Earth? So the answer to that question is that researching topics in space, and space medicine being one of them, is the things that we can learn from space medicine research, and we can apply that to life on Earth. So again, going back to the research that I'm doing, that's one thing that I'm focusing on is learning how interdisciplinary healthcare can be provided in space, and how can that be applied to remote environments on Earth. And there's a fact that sticks in my mind, which is from the UN, which says that despite the massive increase in urbanization that's meant to be predicted by 2050, there's still going to be 3.1 to 3.3 billion people living in a remote environment by 2050. And that doesn't include people that are traveling to a remote environment. And furthermore, doesn't include people that are caught temporarily in a remote environment as a consequence of conflict, as being a refugee, or even in the aftermath of a natural hazard induced disaster. So there's a huge number of people that need that healthcare system in a remote environment. And space research and space medicine research is a way that we can draw on and improve that practice in remote environments.
Yeah, you bring up a very good point. Actually, there's a lot of space technology we rely on today. I mean, the most granted one in my life is the GPS. I mean, as a new learner, I've just literally got my permit. So, being able to have that GPS it's an amazing tool. And without it, I can't imagine, and I'm sure a lot of people around the world can't imagine driving. So simple technologies like you being able to use your phone, communicating with people across the world. I'm able to talk to you because of space technology. So I think, we take a lot of that for granted, and especially in the space medicine sector. That kind of leads me to a new question, which is, so I was recently reading an article that was published by NASA, and they were saying how certain cells or certain bacteria behaves differently in microgravity environments compared to how they behave here on Earth, the laboratory that they have here. And so they were able to discover new characteristics that bacteria had that they weren't able to here because of the gravity environment. So which I thought was really cool, because we would think, oh, we know everything because we did research here, but when you go to a different environment, they behave differently. So, that excites me. So what are your thoughts on this?
I mean, that's very much focusing on that biomedical model again, and it is absolutely fascinating. And we really only just lifted the lid on this. That anecdote and that paper reminds me that I just wrote a textbook about what's called person-centered care. That textbook was for something that we've got in the UK called nursing associates. They're a new nursing profession. But the why that reminded me of that textbook that I wrote was using that person-centered approach towards healthcare. We're not Each individual is unique. Even from a biomedical perspective, our chemistry is very, very different. And if we broaden that lens again to a holistic perspective, our backgrounds and our interpretation, our cultural backgrounds, religious backgrounds, all of that will affect our health in a different way, and our interpretation of health will be very different. So, as a healthcare practitioner in space medicine and space health, how can we accommodate that? The answer is to provide interdisciplinary, person centered, evidence based care. In short, we can't tarnish everyone with the same brush, because we don't respond to medicines or to an excuse me, to an environment in the same way. It's completely different.
Yeah, I think that's definitely something that we need to like take into consideration and think about. And so kind of moving a little bit away from your research and kind of diverting, I'm also curious throughout your journey in going into space medicine, did you always imagine yourself, from a little kid to now to be in the position you are in today, or did you have some twists and turns? Because I did know you were mentioning how you were a nurse. So, how did you have some twists and turns in your journey?
I absolutely did have some twists and turns for sure. I never thought that I would do a PhD at all. I mean, going back to school, I knew I wanted to work in healthcare. I considered medicine, I considered paramedic science, but I, in the end, chose nursing because I really liked the idea that nurses spend the majority of time with patients. And I still enjoy working with people. And nursing was the profession that enabled me to do that. At that time, when I started my nursing degree, I was really interested in emergency care. I still am to a certain extent. I always thought, though, at that time that I would spend my career working as an emergency nurse in the emergency room or accident and emergency. Um, I did a placement there in that department. I had a job when I finished in accident and emergency. But then my career kind of took a turn because during my undergraduate degree, I did a what's called an elective placement in an academic department. So I discovered education. So to again cut that long story short, I was in a position when I finished my degree to choose this career in emergency nursing, or to choose a wild card and join an academic department as a junior lecturer. So I decided to go with the wild card, and I became a junior lecturer, and that was involved in creating and designing workshops for clinical practitioners about improving practice education to ultimately improve patient care. I did my master's in education, and I was working as a senior lecturer of nursing in total for about 5 years. Once I had done my master's in education, I began to think I'm really enjoying the research element. I'd quite like to do a PhD. So I wanted to join three topics that I really enjoyed and was really interested in together. So that being nursing, education, and then, as I mentioned earlier on, pre-hospital care, expedition medicine, particularly in a mountain environment, so the remote environment. So that led me to a PhD in risk and disaster reduction, and again focusing on prolonged field care in remote environments, and as I'm now looking at in outer space as well.
Yeah, that's definitely a journey. I think one of the beautiful things about space industry is like you're mentioning, it's interdisciplinary. You can combine many things and include space in it. So you can go on your own track and you can still weave in different space things because space is applicable to our lives more than we realize. So I'm really glad that you're able to get into this type of research because, reading so many things and talking with professionals like yourself makes me realize that this is a huge and important aspect of the space industry or just our human life and being able to advance our understanding. I mean, I'm working with Dr. Batut who does radiation research, and being able to see how radiation research conducted on the ISS can translate to helping maybe potentially curing cancer here on Earth is it's crazy. And seeing that translation is just mind blowing. So yeah. And so
Absolutely.
my next question for you is how do you keep up, your skills so current? Being in the medical industry, everything constantly changes. Also on top of that space industry, that's also an industry that rapidly changes. So how do you keep your skills current? And how do you keep up with the information?
That's a really good question, and the answer to that is to be self-directed in continued professional development. And this isn't just relevant to medicine and healthcare and nursing. This really is about any profession that somebody would want to go into. So there are a huge number of options. Attending conferences, be that in person or virtually, uh, reading a lot, and if you enjoy reading, that's almost a pleasure rather than becoming an arduous task. Um, there's a difference between theory and practice. So having the opportunities to apply theory into practice is very important and really consolidates your understanding and competence in clinical practice. So as I said, my clinical practice, ignoring COVID, is about pre-hospital care in remote environments. So doing that regularly allows the opportunity for you to consolidate your practice. One of the most important things in answer to that question is to not become complacent and to always strive to improve your practice. And in other words, be a critical practitioner. What I mean by that is not be critical of your own practice, as in finding all the faults, but to give a critique of your practice, so a balanced argument, and reflect on your practice, and to identify what you're good at, and then also identify your areas for improvement, and to really pursue those lines of inquiry and improvement, and ultimately that will improve your practice to benefit patient care. So really, it's about being proactive. And if you're interested in the subject, that comes
You
very,
loved
very
it.
easily.
Yeah. And you were mentioning how you're doing your research. And, as a student, I'm always curious how you guys actually conduct this research because, creating that type of setting and environment is difficult. So, how are you able to, I mean, prior to COVID, able to gather data and information to conduct your research?
So I was actually very fortunate that COVID struck at a time when I was early enough in my PhD to adjust the methodology and the research design that I had put together, and late enough that I could still have the time to get a firm grip of what I wanted to look at in my PhD. Originally, I had planned to do some in-person field work over in Pakistan in the Himalayas there. But unfortunately, due to COVID, that was postponed twice, and it won't be happening until next year when I'm nearly finished, hopefully, my PhD. So again, when I was designing the project, I didn't know COVID was going to happen. Obviously, nobody did, but I designed it in a way that was flexible. So I had plan A, B, and C, just so I had that room for maneuver in case something, what turned out to be COVID, happened. So anyone considering doing a PhD or a Masters of Research, something like that, I'd strongly recommend making sure that you do have a plan A, B, and C. And if plan A fails, you have to move on to plan B. But don't be complacent. Move on. Make sure you plan for the D option as well, just in case something else happens. So as a researcher, being dynamic and also being creative is important to make sure that your project can take place.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. And that brings up another question that I had, which is, pursuing this, you've always, you seem like the person who likes to plan and organize, which is just like me. Um, did you have any obstacles when pursuing your, passion and your dreams, and that kind of altered maybe how you thought about yourself and helped you grow as a person?
Um, I mean, a recent example would be funding. Funding is always a concern for anyone doing research, even eminent professors. They still have to source funding. So, in terms of overcoming that hurdle, it's about casting the net wide and looking at all funding options, be that through company sponsorship or research grants, or there are options out there. Essentially, it just takes a long time to find them. The longer answer to that is going back to school. I struggled at school and I found studying difficult. And hence why I said I never thought that I would end up doing a PhD. It wasn't until I went to university that I was diagnosed with dyslexia, which explained all of the reasons why I was struggling at school. I always find it very ironic that dyslexia is called a learning difficulty when it's not being difficult at all. Dyslexia and other learning differences are literally just a different mindset, a different approach to learning. So once I'd recognized that, and I was lucky enough to have some support and to develop my own strategy on learning and writing, um, the hurdle just melted away, and it didn't really have an impact. And I'm fortunate now to have a consolidated strategy where people don't really recognize that I have dyslexia until I tell them. So that's something I'm very proud of, and I'm very pleased at being able to do that. So hopefully that encourages other people that may have dyslexia or may feel that they're not quite good enough to do something. If you've got the determination and the strategy and a support network around you, you can absolutely, as you say, fulfill your dreams.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that with me. Actually, I had a friend in elementary school and she had dyslexia and I remember she'd always get confused with her letters and it was tough for her to in English class. So seeing someone who's able to overcome that and didn't take it as a way to step back, but rather another reason for you to push forward is really inspiring and that motivates the rest of us regardless of whatever obstacles we have, learning differences or a certain disability that came into our life or a certain disease. It's always important to rather than step back, find that as a reason to actually propel forward. So, thank you for sharing that with us.
No problem, no
And so,
problem.
and so I'm also, hearing about how you're so into space medicine. I'm sure there's a few things you're excited and nervous about in the space industry. So I'm curious, what makes you nervous and what makes you excited about the future of the space industry?
I mean, the one thing that makes me nervous is the funding, because research can't happen without funding. So that there is funding out there, as I said before, but that's only temporary. It very much requires the space industry to educate the funders or government, wherever the funding is coming from, about the reasons why space is important, and we've discussed a couple of those reasons. What excites me about space is there is so much that we don't know yet. And that's really exciting, particularly as a researcher when you're on that cusp point of or the limits of knowledge, and not knowing what's around the corner. That's really, really exciting. So just one example is going back to the moon and on to Mars. That will happen within this century, which just seemed ludicrous 10, 15 years ago, when actually in reality it's within 10, 15 years from now that we'll have a human presence on the moon, potentially even further. That's so exciting, and there are so many questions to be answered there. So that's something to really look forward to.
Yeah, we're going rapid, and I think this is good progress, and we should continue our speed because people are starting to realize the importance of space through many individuals like yourself. Students are starting to acknowledge space as a real place for career growth. So as more people get involved, the space industry is definitely going to propel forward. I'm sure a few decades ago we couldn't have imagined the amazing technology we have today. So space has really helped us propel as a society. And so, my last question for you, now that we've gotten to know a little bit about your research and your background, what advice do you have for young students regarding their pursuit of a passion in the STEM field or the space industry? Something that you wish you knew when you were, a younger student.
I would say that choose something that you really enjoy, and don't try and dwell on potential negatives. So things like not thinking you're not particularly very good at something. Find your strengths, find your passions, find your drives, and why you want to get up in the morning. I know that's a bit of a cliche, but it's very true. If you find that topic that you really enjoy, and you find yourself thinking about a topic, even just on your days off or over on the weekend, that's the topic to join, and to pursue. And I would also say, don't worry if you don't have that idea just yet. Even if someone has passed a degree and they've done a degree that they're interested in and they're still feeling like, I don't really know what I want to do, that's totally fine. That's not a problem. In that position, at any age, you just need to try lots of different things and discover what you really enjoy doing, and use that as a process to find out what you're interested in and maybe what you're not interested in. And once you find something that really excites you, that's what you need to do, and that's what you need to pursue, and enjoy the journey, because it is a journey.
Yeah, that is some remarkable advice. I mean, as a student myself, I know ever since I was a little kid, I tried a bunch of stuff. I mean, whether it be going to music classes, dance classes, I mean, basketball, I've tried the whole thing and being able to find my passion was definitely something that took a while. And I know a lot of students, even now, still don't know if this is exactly what they want to do. Going into college, I know people who went into engineering and changed into space policy. And so there's always a way you can change. You just need to continuously not be afraid to dip your feet in everything, like you were saying, and be open to new ideas. Unconventional thoughts, because that's what leads us to revolutionary ideas, and that's how we built our society based off of being innovative and creative. So I want to thank you so much, Mr. Myles, for doing this interview and giving us like a whole new perspective on the space medicine research that's happening and the future of the space industry. It was an amazing time talking with you.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much for the invitation. I've really enjoyed it too.